U.S. President Donald Trump's approval rating has reached the lowest for any newly elected president at 100 days, mainly due to the rollout of his aggressive tariff plan. Why is he taking the risk, and what does that mean for South Korea? Let's turn to Professor Greg Buchak. Welcome back, Professor Buchak.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So it's been less than 100 days since Trump returned to the Oval Office, and his 41 approval rating is the lowest, like I said, for any newly elected U.S. leader. Why is he rushing through his tariff policies at this time?
Right. So in the 2015-2016 campaign, Trump made these very big, surprising promises, not only in the tariff context, but sort of on all kinds of policies. Once he was in office, though, he didn't act on many of them, especially right away. And it wasn't until about 2 years that he imposed tariffs on just a small share of U.S. imports, and many of them were actually rolled back in later trade deals. So in retrospect, it sort of became clear that Trump was very constrained by moderates in his own administration, like Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, by the Career Civil Service. There's even a story that Gary Cohn, who was his chief economic advisor, sort of once yanked papers off of Trump's desk to stop him from pulling out of a trade agreement. So let's contrast that with his second term. I think Trump and his supporters kind of learned from that experience. They've been much more deliberate about staffing the administration with loyalists and people who will act quickly to sort of get ahead of the bureaucratic inertia that slowed him down the first time. And they've also been sort of attacking the executive bureaucracy and administrative state, what Trump kind of derisively calls the deep state, directly. In other words, they sort of knew what the obstacles were and they had a plan to overcome them right away. Now, the other piece of this is kind of the timing around the U.S. electoral cycle. Now, everyone, I think, including Trump, expects that tariffs are going to cause some short-term pain. The administration wants that pain to sort of play out early before midterms in 2 years and the next presidential election in 4, so that voters might start seeing the benefits later. Now, I think there's a lot of disagreement about whether there actually will be any long-term benefits, but Trump and many in his administration do sincerely believe that whatever we get in the longer term will be worth the short-term cost.
Well, good news for countries around the world is that there is just a 90-day tariff pause for now. Professor Buchak, would you say that's Trump's own deadline to resolve that trade deficit issues he's been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I really think this 90-day pause is about setting the tone and pace of negotiations. Trump loves deal making, and the tariffs pauses, these deadlines, they're all sort of part of that process. I think it's keeping pressure on the counterparties and perhaps giving local firms time to sort of plan where they source and manufacture their products. Trump, as even in his administration will admit, he's pretty unpredictable. So it's hard to guess where this goes if the deals fail to materialize. My best guess is, while part of Trump's stated motivation here is to reshore U.S. manufacturing, a big part of it is also trying to build a coalition to counter what Trump sees as some Chinese abuses on trade and other areas. So if he doesn't get what he wants after 90 days, I think his reaction is going to depend on sort of who he's negotiating with and where they stand with China.
Well, for South Korea, Seoul and Washington are looking to draw up this July package, but to realize a package deal that works in favor of South Korea, what would be crucial for Seoul to appeal to the U.S. in negotiations in the coming weeks or even months? What do you think?
So I think the tariffs on U.S. allies like South Korea are really bargaining tools. Trump doesn't ultimately want to impose them. I think he's using them to bring countries to the table. Part of it is he's looking to build this trade coalition against China and also score some sort of big headline wins that he can show voters on U.S. manufacturing and energy. So, if South Korean firms agree to build more cars in the U.S., partner with the U.S. shipbuilders, buy U.S. gas, Trump can kind of look at these and sell them to voters as a big win that was brought about by tough negotiation. Now, I do think a lot of these deals would actually be mutually beneficial without the threat of tariffs hanging over them. But, Trump likes this style, and using this pressure lets Trump kind of claim that he was this big, tough, successful negotiator, which plays very well to his image domestically and among his biggest supporters.
Well, Trump himself mentioned shipbuilding and LNG as bargain tools for South Korea. Now, based on the consultations held last week, will South Korea's LNG imports, though, be enough as a leverage for South Korea to find a breakthrough in the whole Trump tariff policies?
Sure. So I think you're referring to something that's on the table, which is this Alaska liquid natural gas project. So Trump is trying to get South Korea, Japan, Taiwan to invest and commit to buying natural gas that's extracted in the far north of Alaska. So the big advantage of this is Alaska's obviously much closer to Asia. And in particular, shipments from Alaska, they don't have to pass through the Panama Canal, while shipments
Right.
from Houston, which is sort of the normal liquid natural gas port, they do. So shipping from Alaska would reduce shipping times from about 30 days to about a week. Liquid natural gas from the US is also sort of this potentially politically attractive thing from the South Korean side because it kind of avoids sourcing energy from more unstable suppliers like in the Middle East. They tend to have also more flexible contractual terms for historical reasons. So
Well,
like why does Trump like this? So Trump wants to boost US energy and a project like this is very visible, it's very tangible, and Trump seems to love these very visible and tangible things. To give you kind of a funny example, when I was in Chicago for grad school, there was this big Trump condo hotel building downtown that said Trump on it in very big letters. And people who lived there fought over and over to try to get this name taken off, but Trump would work very hard to keep the name on his building. And I think that's really emblematic of what Trump likes and what Trump cares about. Anything that has this flavor is very appealing to him. So, the LNG deal, is that enough? It's hard to say, but it definitely has the flavor of the kind of deal that Trump really likes.
that's a perfect example that shows his character. Now, last but not least, South Korea did make a counterproposal to establish a consultative body with other Asian countries last week. The question is, how feasible is this idea, realistically speaking?
So, the idea to form a buyer's club for natural gas that kind of strengthens the negotiation hand against the US when it sells natural gas. If it works, South Korea would definitely benefit from being able to negotiate on lower prices or other more preferential terms. But keeping a buyer's club together is pretty tough. So even OPEC, which is kind of the seller's version of this, has struggled in recent years because of divergent interests among the members. And as I'm sure you're aware, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and so on sometimes have very different interests. So I would expect similar difficulties here, but beneficial if they could pull it off.
All right, Professor Buchak, thank you so much for connecting with us. You enjoy the rest of your weekend there.
Thank you. Take care.